Classical analytical psychology faces a growing risk of scientific isolation. By relying on biological determinism to explain the origins of our deepest mental structures, the field moves further away from the findings of modern neuroscience. This problem originates with Carl Jung. To explain recurring universal symbols, he hypothesized that archetypes were inherited biological entities, what he likened to Mendelian particles. He proposed that humans are born with innate blueprints of imagery already coded into our biology. Yet Jung struggled to define exactly how this biological transmission occurred. When attempting to explain the structural core of these patterns, the archetype-as-such, he fell back on vague analogies, suggesting it was like the invisible axial system of a crystal lattice, shaping a crystal in a saturated solution. He also relied on animal behaviors to justify his theory, arguing that humans produce typical mythologisms the same way a weaver bird instinctively produces a nest without prior instruction. As developmental biology and cognitive science have advanced, this specific proposition has become a theoretical liability. The idea that the human mind contains pre-formed genetic blueprints prevents analytical psychology from integrating with contemporary models of the brain. Oxford professor and analyst Jean Knox offers a revision to this theory through what she calls the Emergent model. Her primary argument is that archetypes are not inherited packets of imagery waiting for an environmental trigger. Instead, she defines emergence as mental contents that arise from the dynamic interaction between our genes, the brain's self-organizing processes, and the environment. In this model, archetypes are recategorized as reliably repeated early developmental achievements. They are patterns that form as we grow, rather than structures we are born with. This shifts the view of the human brain from a rigid, hardwired repository of ancient symbols into a self-organizing system that learns how to structure reality through experience. This reorientation moves the origin of the archetype from a mystical preformation toward a developmental process that can be studied and observed. To understand how these patterns form, we have to look at the beginning of human experience, an infant interacting within a physical, three-dimensional space. Out of this constant interaction with gravity, objects, and boundaries, the infant begins to form the earliest building blocks of cognition. Cognitive scientists call this the image schema, the concept Knox uses to replace Jung's archetype-as-such. Image schemas are primitive mental gestalts derived directly from an infant's earliest bodily experiences. When a child reaches for an object or moves through space, the brain records these physical rules into basic patterns. These early schemas contain no symbolic, mythological, or representational content. They are strictly geometric and spatial rules. However, they function as an invisible scaffolding, providing a contentless ground plan upon which all future meaningful imagery and thought will be organized. Because they are formed in the pre-verbal stages of infancy, these organizational templates operate outside of conscious awareness. Before a child can process a complex psychological myth, they must first build the architectural wireframes of basic physical reality. Research has identified a specific set of these core image schemas formed by infants, including concepts like path, link, out, splitting, up-down, force, and part-whole. The path schema is the simplest conceptualization of an object following a physical trajectory through space, without regard for the specific characteristics of the object itself. When path couples with the link schema, the infant develops a primitive concept of animacy, the recognition that living things follow certain trajectories and move in ways that are coupled with other objects. Then there is containment. This develops from the physical bodily experience of a boundary, such as the infant being physically held and surrounded by a mother's arms. These spatial rules move into the realm of psychology through metaphorical extension, where the brain projects physical forms onto abstract thought. In the containment schema, the literal sensation of being held is metaphorically projected into the psychological feeling of being emotionally regulated and understood by another person. This metaphorically extended, highly complex psychological schema is what Jung identified as the archetypal image. This reveals the paradigm shift. There is no genetic archetypal mother, only the physical schema of containment extended into a psychological mother figure. For the student, the distinction is now clear. The empty image schema is the archetype as such, and its metaphorical clothing is the archetypal image. To explain how these empty frameworks are filled with emotional weight, Knox integrates John Bowlby's attachment theory. Bowlby observed that early experiences with caregivers allow an infant to construct internal working models. The primitive image schemas provide the scaffolding for a child to build these models of human relationship, organizing the raw data of interpersonal interactions into a generalized pattern. A child uses these models to anticipate future human encounters, evaluating new relationships based on the patterns established with their earliest caregivers. The stability of this model depends on a key variable, the caregiver's reflective function. Reflective function is the caregiver's capacity to perceive, understand, and organize the infant's chaotic mental states. This process of mirroring and organization turns disorganized spatial schemas into stable relational models. Our deepest relational patterns are not inherited from a collective unconscious, but are biological schemas populated by our earliest attachment experiences. These early developmental schemas dictate the dynamics of the modern clinical setting between the analyst and the client. Transference, countertransference, and the mechanisms of healing are all governed by these internal working models. This makes the concept of the wounded healer essential in therapy. The idea, represented by the myth of Asclepius, that the physician's own experience of suffering grants them the insight to cure others. True healing capacity emerges when the analyst integrates their own internal working models, allowing them to act as a clear, reflective mirror for the patient. We began with the need to save the archetype from the scientific dead end of biological determinism. Practitioners no longer need to look to mystical realms or genetic coding to explain the origins of psychic structures. In Knox's framework, the abstract scaffolding of the image schema merges with the relational data of early attachment to form the archetype as such. This emergent model bridges the subjective focus of psychoanalysis with the objective rigor of cognitive neuroscience. The emergent mind proves that our most profound psychological myths are built from the ground up through the lived experience of relationship.